Shabbat Shalom for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. Well, we have come to the end and the beginning of a new Torah cycle. I'm excited. There's a couple reasons that I am. I, I I think that there's a lot to be said about the design of a scroll versus the design of a codex. We can talk a little bit about that, but the premise is that basically a codex, you take all the pages of a scroll and you sew them together at one edge, and that ends up becoming something you can actually flip through and read, versus a scroll which you roll, and you have to roll to a specific point in order to find the thing. And I can tell you, from having been a steward of the scroll many times in many congregations, I can tell you that I have had my fair share of taking the time to roll the scroll back at the end of the year, but also each Shabbat rolling the scroll to its point. There's some intriguing elements of that, and the first of which is that basically what is rolled in to either side is inaccessible, which means that there's hidden knowledge, right? There is knowledge to be had, and there's knowledge that we've already gained. The knowledge that we've gained is in the larger part of the scroll at the end of the year, and the smaller part of the scroll at the beginning of the year as we roll the scroll. Well, there's an intrigue to this, because that means that in the process of rolling the scroll, we are experiencing something new each time. Now, in times past, as a Protestant Christian, I had my fair share of encounters with the Word of God actually being contextually attached to my life experience at that time. In other words, it was almost like picking up a horoscope in a newspaper and it being exactly what was happening in my life at that moment. Well, in context with that whole idea, we could get into the idea of coincidences, and we could get into the idea of energies, and we get an idea of attractions. But the truth is in the end, one of the things that we are actually encountering is an alignment, right? A cyclical alignment. What do I mean by that? If you're reading through the Bible in a one-year reading schedule, and you're reading a story that just so happens to correspond to what's happening in your life at that moment, one could argue that that cycle was attached to that moment. Now, we could get into all kinds of whys and hows and cause and effect of how that occurs. What prompted you to do the one-year Bible reading? Did a friend offer you and say, hey, this one's really cool? Or did you just kind of feel on your heart to do it? And now all of a sudden, you have come into alignment with that cycle. Well, there's some power behind that, and there's some interesting information behind that. One of the first things that I want to get into is the concept of the curve. Okay. We're going to get on the board here in a minute, and right here at 11:11, we're going to actually step into a realm of visualization with the cycles of time. Now, there's a couple things that are very important. The first thing you need to know is that Hebrew philosophy, ancient nomadic Hebrew philosophy, does not correspond to Jewish philosophy today. An ancient nomadic Hebrew philosophy does not correspond to Christianity at all. Okay? So where it's somewhat similar to Judaism, and it's somewhat similar to esoteric, Kabbalah, mystical studies of Torah, it is contrasted to Christian, or I should say, neo-pagan practices. Now, I know that the moment that I say neo-pagan practices and attach that to the word Christian, some people are going to turn off the video. I don't care. The ones who stayed, here we go. So short version is the moment that we started trying to assimilate or we tried to assign the value of Christ to pagan practices, we have completely divested ourselves of dominion and authority and have become a worshiper of the creation more than the creator. You say, how's that possible? I stand in services on Sunday and we worship and I raise my hands and I love God. And I love God so much. In fact, I have this great relationship with Christ, and I am very, 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 very intimately involved with him. Well, okay, except that he said, don't learn the customs of the nations and do not worship me the way the nations worship me. So if you are doing something that has something to do with a pagan practice, however old it is, you can't make it Christian. And that's what has happened. So when I say neo-pagan, that's what I mean. Somebody who's taken paganism and they have made it new and then attached a new value to it. Okay, so when we're working with this, what we need to do is we need to go back to a point in time where that is not true, where pagan influences are not there. What does that mean? That means January is not the start of the year. That means Sunday is not the day of worship. That means that the moon is not just something in the sky, but is a cyclical process of information. Okay? That means that the woman's menstrual period is not just a nuisance. That means that the man's processes of physiology is not just a time of anxious need for release, okay? All of these things have something to do with a repeat. And I'm going to show you and prove to you that the word relationship itself is cyclical. And then we're going to get into some deeper stuff. This cycles series may last weeks. When we finally get through this, when we finally understand this, we'll go back to our 10 Commandments, because I promise you that is not something that I just said, oh, we're going to do this, and then I changed my mind. However, at Sukkot, I was given a message, and I was given an understanding of what we were about to get into, because for whatever reason, it is time. Now, having said that, there's something very important you need to know, and that is that the concept of measuring of time in terms of hours is pagan. That's right. In the ancient Hebraic nomadic lifestyle, you did not have a schedule, and you did not have timings. In fact, Yeshua said something that I don't think this generation is capable of doing. He said, don't say, I will go do this thing. I will go conduct this business on this certain day in this certain city, for tomorrow is not promised. What does it say? It means don't have a schedule. Ugh. I mean, even thinking about that in terms of our businesses, and I try not to think about our businesses on Shabbat, it gives me anxiety. But I propose to you that we can at least apply the philosophy and maybe even eventually adapt it to our lifestyle. Because what Yeshua said, the things that Yeshua said were powerful. They were not just arguments that he made with the Jews. They were not just things that caused him to be an outcast and a rebel and all these things, because dear God in heaven, American Christianity believes that all Christ did was went in there and turned the tables upside down. They have no idea how much he actually did practice Talmudic Jewish law. The intensification of all power in the universe stuffed into a human, bringing the actual power and actualization of Torah, actually honored the oral Torah. Now, we won't get into that because, of course, there are statements that say, oh, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you make the traditions of men annul the Torah of Yahweh, the word of God, right? Okay, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to get back to this idea of the Hebrew understanding of time. Okay? So let's talk a minute about how all this works, because we have a Talmudic, which would be a post first century understanding. We have a Mishnaic, which would be first century understanding. Well, even first century BC understanding, 100 years before Christ, right? 100 years before the Common Era. But in its context, still does not reflect the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle, philosophy, and culture. You say, why would that be important? Well, because it seems as though every single shepherd, which would be a prophet, a priest, or a prince, who was anointed, seemed to have a nomadic lifestyle and a nomadic philosophy. Once they stepped out of their nomadic lifestyle, they maintained a nomadic philosophy. What do I mean by that? I mean, there are times when Hebrews dwelt in tents, and there's times when Hebrews dwelled in houses built of stone. And when they dwelt in houses built of stone, they still maintained the lifestyle. They maintained the philosophy. And if you recall, generally speaking, the ancient nomadic philosophy has 6 pieces to it, right? That have to do with politics, have to do with hospitality, have to do with how to treat, work with, and enter into covenant with enemies, or at least with opponents, etc. Okay, has to do with culture, has to do with uh has to do with like preparation or self-reliance. Okay, we won't get into those 6 tenets today, but the premise is that the ancient Hebrew lifestyle and culture and philosophy is different than your American Christian thought process. Let me help you understand. American Christians believe that there is at the heart of every American Christian a revolutionary. We're supposed to throw off the tyranny, right? Throw off the tyranny of the law, right? Throw off the tyranny of the curse of sin. Throw off the tyranny of King George. Throw off the tyranny of a federalized government versus sovereign states or sovereign citizens. So at the heart of American Christianity is an actual philosophy of revolution. And so Christ is this great revolutionary who came in and delivered us from the law and delivered us from the Jewish overlords and delivered us from the Roman paganism. That's not quite how all this works. And that's not what happened. One of the things that happened is that when he felt that something was out of order, he dealt with it. But when it wasn't out of order, he didn't try to fix what wasn't broken. And Talmud was not broken. Now, Talmud of our time contains some pretty nasty stuff. For example, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, son of Mary, who they call Yeshu ben Mariamne, which means may his life and his memory be blotted out forever. That's what Yeshu means. Is boiling in feces in hell. That's in Talmud. Bad idea, right? Not exactly our version of understanding of our Messiah, right? But does that mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater? No, because he practiced Talmudic things. Why is that so important? Because we need to divest ourselves. We need to disassociate ourselves. We need to disfellowship ourselves from the anti-Semitic, antinomian, neo-pagan philosophy of Christianity. Christians are proselytized Jews who have accepted the Messiah. Get over it. That's exactly what they were at the time of Paul. And the question as to whether they needed to be circumcised for that was the only issue at hand. A practicing of Torah, all of those other things was included in the philosophy and understanding and belief of even James the Just, who wrote the letter that said, abstain from things strangled, from blood, from sexual immorality, and from idols, right? Okay, simple. But there was more to it, right? Why? Or what does that mean? Whatever he said beforehand has a causative element in this next statement. For or therefore, right? Dia, in the sense of through this thought, right? For Moses, who's Moses? The Torah and the oral Torah is preached in the synagogues on the Shabbat from ancient times. What's ancient times to a Hebrew? A long time ago. And so James, the just, the leader of the Jerusalem Council, member of the Sanhedrin, the Jews will never admit that, member of the Sanhedrin, and definitely the moral majority of the Sanhedrin, says this: let them abstain from idols, let them abstain from things strangled, let them abstain from sexual immorality, and let them abstain from drinking blood, right? Which was at the core of the cultural practices of that time by the uncircumcised Romans, Greeks, barbarians, Scythians, right? We could get into who all those are, but let's just leave that alone for now because it's not Jewish. But when they became converts, they became Jewish, and they went to synagogue until synagogue made it impossible for them to participate in it. And that was when they added the 19th prayer to the Shemoni Esrei, or to the 18 prayers. We won't get into that today either, but that is one of the places where there is a division. Why? Because the house of Shammai prevailed over the house of Hillel, and the house of Shammai's prevailing thought was that the Gentiles could never be brought into the fold. So much so that when Paul stands up, speaks in Hebrew in front of all the men of Israel, they all become quiet. He talks about Yeshua. He talks about the road to Damascus. He talks about all these signs and wonders, and then says, it is because of these things that I have been given the opportunity to go to the Gentiles. And that's when they say, away with such a man who is not worthy to live. When I bring the uncircumcised, confused, without God pagans into the fold, now all of a sudden he's worthy of death. Why is that so important? Because when we get into this lifestyle, you're going to understand that this was practiced by the disciples. It was practiced by Yeshua. It was practiced by everyone, which means what? In the sight of a Hebrew, Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews, if you don't recall. That's very different from a Jew. He was a Hebrew, and he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, which means he maintained the ancient nomadic lifestyle, which meant that his home was not permanent, but neither was his philosophy about life. And that was one of the things that Yeshua brought up when he said, don't be making plans for the future because tomorrow is not promised. Now, let's talk a minute about the East and the West. So recall in times past that I have drawn on the board. I'm not going to do it right now because there are people who are tired of seeing it, which is interesting to me, but there are people who are tired of seeing the shoreline with the sun in the background of the Mediterranean Sea, the guy standing on the shore with his hands up. But what you don't realize is as he's looking out over the unknown, what he is facing, right? He has already known. He already sees and understands, which means what? It is the concept that if his back is to the sun, that is the future because it has not yet been seen. His back is to the sea, that is the past, which has already been seen, even though there's that unknown on the Mediterranean itself of what is it? We don't know what that thing does, but we know that it is very, very angry and it is very, very grouchy and it doesn't get along with our people very well. And to the extent that in general, do not live by the sea. which made it possible for the Philistines or the Palestines to what? To dwell by the sea, Ashkelon, Ekron, etc. Right? Okay. So when we're dealing with an understanding of the Hebrew, we have to realize that what is in front of us has already been known, and what's behind us is not known. That's a very different understanding compared to Westernized thought. Now, there's a reason why that's important, and that is because that means that which is observed is the past. That which observed is completed. That which observed is no longer required to be known. Well, it's interesting because guess what is in that philosophy? Time. To a Hebrew, there's no such thing as time. And the reason why this is so important is because the past is already known. It's in front of us. We can see it. We can remember it. We can observe it. That's not time. There is no actual function of process built into that action. And what I mean by that is that there's nothing you actually can do about it. You already know it. It's done. What is not known is not promised. What does that mean? You are not guaranteed that next moment. That next moment is an imagination at best, and we do not know whether or not that imagination will come to pass. And when we get into the actual reaction to a negative imagination, we get into fear. That's a whole nother part and a whole nother series. That's going to be our Renewing the Mind series. But the premise is that the action of the movement of time, the idea of something progressing into the future, does not exist in the Hebrew philosophy. Now, I know that you have a watch on your wrist that says tick, 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 tick. Oh, it's the future. But the truth is that's not true either, because the only moment that's actually real on your watch is the present. Albeit as 1 second progresses on, that present became the past. It's already known. And the second that hasn't come yet, we don't know if it exists. I know that that is way foreign to a Western mindset. But what we need to understand is there is definitely a pagan, and when I say pagan, I need to clarify something. Because I probably shouldn't use that word, but I really don't have another way to describe it to Christians because they love that word, right? They think that word means anybody who doesn't have Christ, as it were, but they also attach it to witchcraft and sorcery and all kinds of other things. They like to put the word pagan there. The truth is that a pagan, from a pagan's understanding, is someone who worships the earth, okay? A worshiper of earth. But that is not necessarily what I'm working with when I use that word pagan. I'm using the Christian definition of somebody who is definitely not only not in the fold of Christ, but who is outside of that, of the practices of Christianity. Different philosophy, different values, etc., etc. Okay, because I don't want to become offensive with the word pagan. I just want to use that word as a contrast to the Hebrew, okay? We could go with uncircumcised, whatever, but that then gets into all kinds of controversy. We could go with Gentile, but Christians call themselves Gentiles pridefully. I'm a Gentile Christian. Congratulations. You're an uncircumcised Philistine who's not Israel and not in the inclusion of what Paul was trying to include people into. But by your philosophy, being a Gentile Christian is something special because somehow that makes you like this extra adopted thing, when truly a Gentile is somebody who's confused without God and a pagan. So it's hard to use the terminology here, but the best way I could put it to you is in pagan thought, there is a future, and in pagan thought, there is that second is going to come. Now, somebody say, well, wait a minute. Didn't you teach that the the rainbow says that seed time and harvest, cold and heat will come as long as the earth remains. Yeah, but how do you know the earth is going to remain in that next second? You don't. And that was the only condition of that promise. There was only one condition: as long as the earth remains. Well, there's a lot we need to get into, but basically that's kind of the introduction here, is that what you understand about time is about to change. And what is scary about it is how much we have been in error of the concept of time. Because we have what as our dimensions? 4 dimensions, right? Height, width, depth, time, space. I'm sorry, height, width, depth, space, and time. So we have a location in a temporal continuum, let's call it. Location in a linear process, a linear progression, location in a linear progression, and then in a definable space. So a Y, an X, and a Z, somewhere in time. Okay, that is our 4 dimensions. That is the world of formation. I know that there are certain Kabbalists or Orthodox Jews who will argue that the world of formation is not height, width, depth, time, but the world of Asiya is height, width, depth, time. And I challenge that and say, and God formed out of the dust of the ground the atom, and he breathed into his nostrils, and he became a what? A chafesh, or I'm sorry, a nefesh chayi, a living soul. That is this place, this moment of existence in the grand scheme of time. That is when the world of formation emanated and manifested physically. The reason why this is important is because now all of a sudden, if time doesn't exist, then now we do not need to locate ourselves on the progression of it. Now, does time exist in the reality of the American Christian today? Yes, of course it does. You have to adapt to scheduling. You have to say, yes, I will schedule this appointment on this day with the dentist. Probably don't want to go to the dentist, but you still have to what? Fall into the slot of availability of time for that dentist on that date, which Yeshua says, don't do. So obviously we've got our work cut out for us, right? To try to adapt this philosophy into our reality. Because it was almost as if we would have to do walk-ins, right? That would be the premise. Oh, you know what? My mouth needs attention. Hi, can I come in right now? Oh, I can't. Okay, goodbye. Right? And that doesn't work. We have to schedule. We have to schedule. So please understand, in this Western society and in this understanding right now, those things are not options. Now, there's some intrigue to the thought process here, right? Because you have the idea of doing a walk-in and somebody did the walk-in before you, so you got to wait an hour. Well, that would mean that you are waiting for the future to come, right? I don't know. We would have to get deeper into that thought process. Okay, so why is all of this so important? Because when Torah says something in detail, Torah means what it said. Okay? So I know that right now in the progression of time of the Torah portions, we're already in Noach, because most of the Torah schedules that are available based upon the Hillel postponements, and therefore not upon the observing of the moon, and therefore not upon the accuracy of the information provided to us in Torah about how to know when to keep a feast day, which means everybody's a week ahead of where we're at. Now, there's a couple of reasons why that's important. But the biggest reason that's important is because we want to what? Go back to an alignment of the natural order processes of our reality. Okay, so the way that we need to do this is the first thing we need to do is we need to talk about a cycle. And there's a couple things that involves, and there's a couple reasons why it's important. And I know that some of you have already seen some of this at Sukkot, because I gave those who had actually shown up and participated in Sukkot a taste of what was to come. But we're going to discuss it in greater length and in greater philosophy here in a minute. So let's start by looking at a specific verse in Genesis chapter 1. Now, I will prepare you for the fact that when I first began my journey with, I guess I need to explain that a little bit when I say my journey. There's a point in time where I got so aggravated with the fact that every time I turned around, I was finding anti-Semitic, antinomian sentiment in American Protestant Christian social democratic hedonism that we call Christianity, that I decided to just throw the Bible away. I decided I was done. I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. It was a bunch of contradictions, hypocrisy, and lies. And I was done. I was like, where would I even start? Well, it's interesting. I had an American Protestant reformist, who's going to be an anti-Semitic, antinomian, tell me, well, aside from studying the other religions and seeing if that's where you need to be, start in Genesis. So I took his advice and I went and studied other religions. Well, eventually I concluded that I could not find what I was looking for in those other religions, although I found a lot of truth and I found a lot of things that actually worked for my life. There were things that were missing. And so I said, okay, tampered with, inappropriately translated, manipulated by the scribes, manipulated by the Christians, I'm still going to study the Bible. Started in Genesis chapter 1, and after 10 years, I finally got to go to Genesis chapter 3. And after 15 years, I actually made it into not Genesis chapter 3, Genesis 1:3. Then after 15 years, so started in Genesis 1, 10 years went by, and I finally got to do Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. So I was in Genesis 1:1 for 10 years. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 for 10 years. I had to study that long. And I was never allowed to leave that verse. And then I got to move to verse 3. And then by the end of 15 years, I was actually in chapter 3, verse 16. And that's how far I had made it. What's my point? I have spent over 15 years in Genesis chapters 1 through chapters 3. And I could tell you that in them I have gained great insight. Well, it's time to share some of that insight. So what we are going to do is we're going to look into Genesis 1, and there's a number of things that we need to do here. We need to look at how it was originally communicated, how it was originally supposed to be read, and how it was originally supposed to be understood. And we're going to look at all of those things today because I am going to help you detach yourself from the philosophy that is actually preventing you from elevating, preventing you from moving into a higher self, moving into a higher state. Okay, so having said that, we're going to jump into this verse right here in Genesis chapter 1, verse 13. I'm sorry, verse 14. And I'm using the Young's literal translation. I will probably be using that a lot because I'm not looking for readability. I'm looking for tenses. I'm looking for mood. I'm looking for grammar because those all are going to be very important when we understand what's actually going to be communicated. And God saith. Well, that's interesting. Isn't saith a present tense? It's not a past tense. And God saith. In other words, he's still saying it. Let luminaries be in the expanse of the heavens. Okay, that has definitely a beginning, right? That is a imperative. And if it is an imperative, that means it is a command, but it is an instruction. And this is how it would be understood in the Hebrew or in the English. There will be luminaries in the expanse of the heavens, a promise that would occur to make a separation between the day, right? Which is yom, which is what? A work in chaos, right? The drawing of the Hebrew hand at work, and the mem being the chaos or the disorder, a work in disorder. And the night, right? The night being a cyclical process, which we'll get into here in a minute. Lila, using more than one Hebrew letter twice creates a cycle. We're going to get into that. Okay, then they have been. Oh gosh, what's that? Have. It is a completed action. They have already been. Remember, he's saying this all the time forever because it's present tense. They have already been for signs, which is otiot, which we'll get into, for seasons, moedim, for days, yomim, and for years, shamayim. I'm sorry, shanaim. Okay. You say, well, what is all that? Well, first of all, let me tell you what it's not. It's not a clock. It's not hours. We did not have the practice of the watches and the practice of the hours until we had Roman pantheistic or polytheistic philosophy infiltrate our faith. When I say our, I mean the Hebrew Israelite faith. And no, I am not talking about those dudes who wear purple and march around New York claiming to be the true heir to earth. I am talking about those who are of the house of Israel under the new covenant and who demonstrate that through a Hebrew lifestyle, culture, and language philosophy. Okay? All right. So these Israelites who are Hebrew did not have watches based upon hours. Listen, when they're out there in the Sahara Desert, the Saudi Arabian desert, the Gobi Desert, depending on how exiled they were, they did not have a clock to establish their watches. That is not how they measured time. It had to do with the changing of the luminaries. It had to do with the changing of the things that moved through the sky. That's how they knew the watches. But they were not measured by hours. That's not how it worked. Now, having said that, I think it's very important to understand the difference between a clock with seconds and cycles. We're going to get into cycles here in a minute. As you can see behind me, there's a cycle of the stars occurring with a really long shutter on it. Okay, so here we are at verse 14, and we're looking, and it doesn't say, let the sun be for warmth. It doesn't say, let the sun be for light, but let the sun that makes a separation between the day and the night then they have been for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Meaning what? The establishment of the Moedim, the establishment of the feast days, is wholly contingent upon what? Upon the sun, moon, and stars before anything else comes into existence. They have already been for the Otiot, for the Moedim, for the Yomim, and for the Shanaim. Okay? Now, the reason why that's so important is because it's not for light, it's not for heat, it's not for those things. It is for the cyclical processes, natural order cyclical processes that are occurring. Okay? Now, the good news is whether you're a flat earther or a round earther, this still works, right? This information still works. Okay, so when we're talking about luminaries, I think that's an important Hebrew word we need to get into here. Okay? When we're talking about luminaries, I want you to see what is being said here. This is the word ma'or. Ma'or. A ma'or is used 19 times in the Hebrew. Ma'or is used 19 times in the Hebrew in the King James Version of the Bible. Translated as lights and as brightness. Okay. And if we go into first usage, it is actually Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. Some notable verses that you would like to probably pay attention to is the ones in the Psalms. Okay. But then also we have things like, for example, Numbers chapter 4, verse 9, that has to do with the menorah. The menorah, okay? Which also has the word or in it. But we won't get into that right now. What's my point? My point is that meor or ma'or is actually the idea of light being produced, but not in the sense of how we understand light. Isn't that right? Okay, so having said that, what you need to know is that when a mem is attached to a verb, you add an ing to it. So what is this really saying? Let there be lightings, or let there be strong mindings, right? In the heavens, hashamayim, that doesn't say sky there. It says hashamayim. Let me show you. Okay. Shamayim, heavens. Now it does say the rakia. It does say the rakia right here, the firmament, right? Which we could get into all kinds of things, especially for you flat earthers. But the premise is, it is in the place where the separation of the waters occurred in the heavens. That is not sky. Especially when Yeshua says the kingdom of heaven is within you. Okay? All right. So having said that, now we can understand that when we're dealing with these things, we need to understand what they all mean. For example, luminaries or light is our strong mind, order, right? Order out of chaos. I know that I shouldn't be using that Greek word, but unfortunately in American Christianity, that word means something more than disorder. Disorder on steroids, right? Okay. And maybe that's what I should say, disorder on steroids. Seems like a lot of words. All right. So now what we need to ask is, what were the purposes of these things? So let's go back into the Hebrew really quick. And what we will find is that there is going to be a lamed preposition. So let's talk a minute about the lamed preposition. What is the lamed preposition actually, and what is it not? Okay, so we translate it, or I should say James Strong, right, a American Presbyterian, translates it as what? It translates it as for, to, or um towards. Okay. However, even though that's true, in a sense, what the lamed actually means is for the sake of. And let me explain how this works. Anything that follows the med is dependent upon the thing that was already read. What do I mean by that? I mean it's a dependent clause. The lamed actually creates a dependent clause. And so what does that mean? For the sake of, in other words, as an effect of this cause. So when it says, let them be for, right? Let them be for, it says, let them, and they have been for signs and for seasons and for days and years. We need to understand that lamed preposition is very important. So we could start here. We can start here in this section because that's actually going to be something we're familiar with from our Elohim teachings, and that is Hayah, which is what? Who remembers what Hayah is? Hayah is to bear witness, Okay, let's talk a minute about witnesses. First of all, according to Exodus chapter 20, you shall not bear false witness. False witness being what? Something that is actually not true, even though that your eyes observed something different. So you state something different than what your eyes observed, or vice versa. You observe something different than what your mouth speaks. Okay? All right, so that's bearing witness. Will bear witness to established existence? No. To the work of existence, to the action of existence. And there's a difference between establishment and actioning existence. There's established existence, and then there's actioning existence. At any rate, Hayah, to bear witness to the actioning existence. Okay, so if that's the case, then as we go into this, we understand that this is the idea of to exist as an action. So let them exist as an action for the sake of signs. Ot, used 79 times in the King James Version of the Bible. Always a sign, token, banner, also miracles, and also a mark. Okay? In the sense of appearing. But what does signs really mean? They are markers on a map. Okay? We'll get into that in a minute, but they are markers or points on a map. And we will talk a minute about that. Or we will talk about that in a minute. Okay. The next thing we need to look at is then for Moedim. Moedim. Lamed, right? For the sake of the Moedim. For the sake of the appointed times. Okay, how many times is that used? 223 times it is translated as congregation, feast, season, appointed time, assembly, solemnity, solemn days, signs, and synagogues. However, all of them have the root of ya'ad, to fix or appoint, from the primitive root ayin dalet, which is what? To witness. All of them have to do with observance. So there's some intrigue for you, but we won't get into that quite yet. All right, so getting back to our Moedim, it is for the sake of the, lack of better words, feast days. Okay? So what do we have so far? We have markers on a map. We have feast days. Okay? And then we have leyomim. Leyomim is going to be what? Lamed, for the sake of the days. Of the days. What days? Oh, wouldn't you love to know? Wouldn't you love to know what is meant by days there? And what is this? Years. Why do we need to calculate years? So where's the heat? Where's the solar power? Where's the 364.9999993 days in a year? Where is all that? It's not there. It's not present. And the reason it is not present is because that's not how we reckon time. That's not how we, us Hebrews, reckon time. Okay? So now we have some really special stuff we need to get into. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's talk about dimensions, and let's talk about geometry, and let's talk about all kinds of fun things. So let's go to the board. Okay, let me set up some colors here. I want my finger to be orange. I want my medium pin to be yellow, and I want my little pin to stay blue. That sounds great. Okay, so let's start with the concept here. All right, so if I have a single point, it has no other information. If I was to locate that point in terms of X, Y, and Z, now it is a location on what we call the Cartesian coordinate system. If I was to locate that in terms of a very different kind of map, so there's two kinds of maps. We have a map that looks like this. You should be very familiar with this. It's got marks like this, right? And marks like this, and marks like this. Let's do 4 on each of these. And marks like this. And let's say that we are at this point. Well, then we can come to this line, which maybe is A, and maybe this is 1. And we can say that it is in the quadrant of 2A, right? 2A. That's Cartesian. But then on this side, we have a map like this. Right? Which is more like our radar. But the premise is that this is what we call polar coordinates, right? Where we have a sector, which would be any one of these lines. We have a sector. And so let's say that we have a point like right here. Well, that's in sector 1, okay? And it is in the diagonal or the polar measurement of, say, I don't know, what is that? It's probably about, let's say 120 degrees. So that is in sector 1, 120 degrees. Why? Because each one of these circles is a sector. I guess it would be in sector 2, actually. Sector 2. You know, one of the things I found when I was messing with this whiteboard, when I first started out, you can't scribble over stuff very well. So you have to just erase it and start over. Not used to that. I'm used to just scribbling over stuff. Okay. So you can see those are our two concepts of a map. We have the radar version, we have the Cartesian coordinate version, and there are correspondence between each one of those in terms of mathematics. But in general, that's how we identify things in 2 dimensions, or in our more modern times, we add the Z in and we have 3 dimensions, height, width, depth, time, or height, width, depth. And then, of course, we have this idea or belief that that has something to do with time. Now, having said all that, let's take a look at this from a different perspective. This point right here, without any definition of height, width, or depth, just exists as a single point. If we were to add a second point here, then we would say that this, from this line to this line, is linear. Meaning, no matter whether we travel this direction or we travel this direction, we can only stay on that line. Now, if we were to add another point, then it would not necessarily be linear, would it? We could get to that point. In fact, we could even get to this point by going here and then here. Okay? So now linear has changed a little bit. It has another variation because now we have what? Height. Not only do we have length, but we have height, right? And if we were to continue with this thought process, eventually we would get into a third dimension. And that third dimension would be depth. And I'm just going to connect all these points. Some of you know what this is. I'm going to connect all those points. Okay. Now, I know that's not perfect, and I know that's not exactly how this goes, but you understand in principle that the idea is that if we were, say, to locate something here in all of that, that we would have to look at first this plane back here. I'll color it in so that you know that it is the plane back here. It's this plane, okay? It's that back wall. Okay, so we have this back wall of the cube. So I need to color these in as well so that you understand where the back wall is. That's a dimension where that's located. However, who says that dot is actually on that back wall? It could actually be on this wall right here, right? Which we would color a different color if we were going to get really crazy. But the premise is that the only way that we would know is if there was actually an X, Y, that's going to be our height and our depth. I'm sorry, that's going to be our length and our height. And then our width is going to be Z, or our depth is going to be Z. So height, width, and then depth. Okay, so this Z depth locating system puts us in the 3 dimensions. Now, the reason why this is important is because this is block logic. This is where we can make many connections to one thing in a lot of ways. Linear logic processes off of this system, progressively moving forward. Instead of there being a ebb and flow of process. But is that what we see naturally in the world of the Torah? No, it is not. In fact, it is more common that we would see something along the lines of this, and eventually this, and eventually this, right? See where I'm going with this? Eventually this, eventually this, eventually this. That one's a little bit thin. This, eventually this, eventually this, and back to this. What is that? That's the cycle of the is not a linear process. Mark out this in terms of points on the line. Other line crossed here. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Looks like we got it back. Did we get it back? Okay. Sorry. So we lost lost audio for a minute. And of course, I mentioned at the beginning that we might lose audio because we're kind of working with a injured player on our equipment list. Okay. So the idea here is that we would drop points, right, from each section here onto this linear line, right? This linear progression of time. So we've got this point, 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 and this point, and this point. But do any of those talk about an ebb and flow? Do any of those talk about the condition of the moon at that moment? So let's say that instead what we will do is we will show an XY, which means it's not linear, but it's two-dimensional, right? Which already is going to move us out of the normal progression of time, but also is going to move us out of the normal progression of logic. Why? Because all of a sudden we have to mark out the magnitude of the moon. So let's say that the absolute magnitude of the moon is here, and the absolute minimum of the moon is here. Now, I know that's not the right word, but I don't know what the opposite of magnitude is. All right. So from that point of view, then, somehow we have to progress through. And when we progress through, you'll find that we have an arc. Okay? So let's say that our actual median or our in-between point for before the full moon is here and after the full moon is here. So if that's our median point, then that's technically where our line should be attached. So we'll go ahead and get rid of that line, and we'll get rid of that line, and we'll see if we can't get this a better look to it. And so then now what we have is we have an actual progression up through the median point to the maximum, right? And then from the maximum down through the median down to the minimum. Okay, our minimum point right there. Okay, so if we look at this then, we notice that in terms of process, there is a return to this point. So if this point is 0, and this point is the maximum, we'll just put max here, which is a full moon, and this point is 0, then what do we have? We do not have linear, do we? We have a circle. If something returns to its origin point, it is a circle. Okay? If it goes to the maximum and then slowly progresses back through to the minimum, at the very least, we have a sine wave, but at the maximum, we have a circle. So let's take a look at that really quick. If I draw a circle and I put a center point, and then I draw a linear process through that center point, and then I draw a linear process from the top to the bottom of that center point, and I label this 0 degrees, I label this 90 degrees, I label this 180 degrees, and I label this 270 degrees. And we know that the moon is going along this line in some way, arriving back at 0, meaning that 180 degrees would be its maximum point. Okay, I'm going to change colors here. 180 degrees would be its maximum point. 0 would be its minimum point, and so then these would be the medians. Well, look at that. We have a circle, or we have what we would call a cycle. Now, in terms of that, you've already seen that that looks something like this. Okay? Which means what? There's a, if we were to do a linear measurement of time here, that's how that would look. If we were to take half of this, we have our sine wave. We have something going from low to high in some form. Okay? But that also means that we're working with wave science. We're working with wave physics, or we're working with wave technology, or we're working with wave philosophy. Okay? Now, the reason why this is relevant is because when we look at the otiot, the moedim, and the yomim and the shanaim, we have some interesting information we need to discuss. And that is that there is a beginning, a middle, and an end that always gets back to 0. Now, if you think about the progression of time in terms of how long it takes for a day to occur. So let's start from a normal Roman pantheistic philosophical process of progression of a day. It starts at its darkest point, right? It starts at its darkest point of what we call midnight, which is when the sun is actually in its noonmost time in the other hemisphere, right? That's midnight for us, mid of the night, or the median of darkness. And so we start in darkness, right? And we go halfway and we have absolute light, the most light that we could possibly have in terms of what we perceive to be light, the sun, okay? Then we have a progression from that absolute point of light to the absolute point of darkness, which is a Roman pantheistic philosophical practice concerning when and how you were supposed to worship certain gods. You don't believe me? Go Google it. Go look up time and the worship of Roman gods. Okay? Okay. So the premise is that our pantheistic progression of time starts in darkness. Is that true of the Hebrew? No, it is not. And there's two reasons why it is not. The first is because of a very specific Moedim known as Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is measured from the sundown to the sundown. Passover is eaten between the twilights. We'll talk about twilight in a minute, because there's a nautical twilight and there is an astronomical twilight. And the intrigue behind those has to do with whether or not the light is still visible. Okay? So the nautical twilight is that the stars become visible, because that means you can navigate via the stars. The astronomical twilight is when there is no light visible in the sky except the night luminaries, the moon, the stars. There is no more sunlight producing light. Okay, that's the astronomical twilight. In terms of Hebrew understanding, generally speaking, if we look into Talmud, we will find that that true twilight is the visibility of 3 stars in the sky, which means they went more with the nautical twilight. That's how they interpreted twilight. Now, when we are dealing with this idea of twilight, or we're dealing with this idea of Erev, it is very important to know that it is when the sun drops behind the horizon. That is the beginning of a day, okay? So if we accept this 24-hour or 23.999, notice we still don't have that perfect accuracy. We round it up in order to make it accurate. We have this 24-hour period of time that occurs, and that 24-hour period of time is how long it takes for the sun to go through its entire cycle, okay? So when we're looking at cycles and we're looking at waves, we're going to find something very intriguing occurs. However, we're not going to get there today. We're going to have to really look into some things before we really get our head wrapped around the concept of these cycles. Okay, so the next thing that we need to ask is, what is an otiot? Well, I can tell you what it's not, okay? The Hebrew word for letter, as in the ABCs, is otiot. And some have come along and said that that's what otiot means in this specific verse. However, that is not the case. When we're dealing with the otiot, we are dealing with map coordinates, but very specific ones. And they're the map coordinates on the elliptical and the astronomical anomalies, or the things that occur in the sky, or what we would call astronomical movements of the planets. You say, whoa, 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 whoa. So what you're saying is that we're going to look into astrology. Somewhat yes and somewhat no, because obviously there is an astrology out there that is inappropriately assigned to the Greek and Roman pantheon, and the Babylonian one, and the Persian one, and the Canaanite one, and the Egyptian one, and the Sumerian one. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that there is a very inappropriate assignment of deities to these movers in the sky, or these planets that include the sun and the moon. Okay. So I want to show you something really quick in this verse. And that is verse 15. And they have been, oh, here we go with the past tense. And they have been for luminaries in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth, right? Which is what? The strong mind, but also order, not photon emission. And it is so. I'm going to prove that not photon emission in a second. And it maketh the 2 great luminaries, the great luminary to rule, which should be the word mashal, I believe. Let's take a look. To rule. Yep. Memeshala. To rule or have dominion. Dominion over the day, and the small luminary, or the moon, and the stars, or the kochvaim, or maybe it's kochvaut, for the rule of the night. And we'll get into the Lila, night, in a minute. But as you can see, these have a very, very different existence than what we have tried to have them be. So when we're working with the otiot, there's something that you need to understand. The system of the sun, moon, and stars have been set in process of motion for a very, very long time, a very, very long time. We have constellations that still exist in our moment, that existed in our ancestors' moment, that existed in their ancestors' moment, that existed in Noah's moment, that existed in Adam's moment, that existed before Adam's moment. Meaning what? They've been there a while. They've been there a while. Now, the reason why this is so important is because that clock, which we're going to call it a clock for now, that clock has been ticking for a very, very, very long time, and yet has all the stuff built into it to tell us the story of our Creator. Okay? So the OTOT are actually motions of planets that cause very specific things to occur at very specific points in history. Okay? Now, I could get into the signs in the heavens and all that is encompassing in that, proving when Christ was born, not at Christmas, and proving what feast day he was born at, Sukkot, and what day he was circumcised, the 8th day, all corresponding to the sky. However, and this is very important, those are for another teaching. But what you need to understand is the word signs has to do with the luminaries in the heavens, period. Nothing else. No other instance of the concept of otiot exists. What does that mean? That means when you go read Torah and you see the word sign, it has something to do with the heavens. That's important. Okay, what's our next word? Our next word is Moedim, feast days. There's an intrigue there. We're not going to get into it quite yet, but it's very, very important. Next after that, we have days. Why do we need to know days? Why is there an actual 24-hour period? Because there is an activation of something to do with days that has something to do with creation, which we're going to get into in a bit. The next thing is years, which intriguingly enough has the same process, which we're also going to get into in a minute. Okay. So first of all, what do we have? We have this concept of day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7, and all of a sudden there's not a day 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are the days of creation. Creation was supposedly occurred in 7 days. Now, I will just for a moment be a little bit of a thorn in the side of the Christians and say, how in the world can you create something in 7 days when the 7th day, nothing occurs? In other words, our little young earth thing needs to go to 6 days, not 7, right? Now, if you ask a Jew, there were 10 utterances that created the world, and one of them was, it's not good for man to be alone. Which means what? We're progressively way past that 7th day of creation, which means maybe creation occurred in 2 weeks. Okay, I'll get off that soapbox. Now, so what we need to do is we need to remember that the greatest will be last, right? According to Yeshua, the greatest would be last, and the least would be first, right? That we would have the older serving the younger. We would have the greatest servant going last. The most important, the greatest magnitude going last and not first. What does that mean? That means that the most important thing would be considered last. Meaning what? If Yahweh makes a list, the most important commandment or the most important information would probably come at the last of that list. Now, having said that, don't get me wrong. The first is the firstborn, and that means it receives a double portion or double honor, and we'll get into that in a moment. So now, the premise here is that whatever serves you the greatest will be last, which means the most important or beneficial thing will come last. So what is the deal? Why do we need to know about years? Is it because of age? Well, we definitely see that in Torah, that there's a calculation of age. For example, Methuselah was 969 years old, right? Noah died in this year. And at the age of this, he gave birth to, or he begot this son. And when this son was this old, he begot this son, right? So there is definitely a calculation of age in terms of understanding how many years a person actually dwelt on the earth. However, that is not our clock. And that is not the purpose of our clock. We do not need to know how old we are. And the truth is that actually is only an idea of how much we were actually granted when we died. Methuselah lived 969 years. This is the life of Methuselah. Excuse me, but that's when he died. That's the only reason we have that information, right? In other words, how many years we were granted on the earth only is known after we move on to the next life, right? To the life to come. And so because of that fact, we need to understand that years were never about age. What are they about? Well, it seems as though something is built into creation, and it is known as the Yovel, or the Jubilee. Now, the Yovel, or Jubilee, seems to be some sort of release of all debt, release of all consequence, some form of great mercy. And if you look into the book of Jubilees, which is an extra biblical book, not in the 66 uh, uh, book compendium that took 400 years to figure out, but instead is in the group of books that have been influential not only in Talmud, but have been influential in Jewish philosophy and folklore. The book of Jubilees is actually a counting of Jubilees that starts with the first Jubilee during the time of Adam and works its way forward to many Jubilees in the future. What is a Jubilee? It is a factor of 50, okay? So there's a counting of 50. 50 what? 50 years. But how do you count those 50 years? 7 Shemitas and 1 year. What's a Shemitah? A Shemitah is a 7-year period. Built into the function of creation is a sabbatical year, a time in which you do not plant, you do not harvest in terms of creating a bounty of profit. Quite literally, what happens is in the 6th year, there is supposed to be, and there is a promise of, a bumper crop. That bumper crop will be double what you normally would receive, so that to harvest nor plant or sow during that 7th year. In the 8th year, you sow again, and in the 9th, you finally reap. What's my point here? Doesn't that sound familiar to something else? That something else is what was occurring in the wilderness with the Hebrews with the manna. On the 6th day of the week, the manna fell twice as much to gather in order to have enough to not have to gather on the 7th. Guess what the manna did not do in the 7th? It did not fall. Intriguingly enough, we count 7 Sabbaths, right? The Sabbath being the day the manna didn't fall. Count 7 of those, and then add 1 day, and we have the counting of the Omer, which is also the same as the Jubilee. So it's a miniature Jubilee, as it were. But the premise is that the Jubilee was so important to the Torah and social justice that it actually became a threat that if you did not honor the Jubilee, that you would be cut off from your people. And when you think about cut off from your people, you need to think about when a caravan leaves you in the desert and you don't get to come with them. You have to fend for yourself. You're no longer part of the clan. Okay, so when we're working with this thought process, it is very important to understand that there is a micro and there is a macro process. The macro process is the Jubilee, the 50-year period. The micro process is the Omer and the 50-day period. But built within each one of those is the Shemitah and the Shabbat. The Shemitah, or the counting of 7 years, is similar to the micro Shabbat, which is the counting of 7 days. Now, it's very important to know that in the context of agricultural processes, not only is there a necessity for this seventh year rest, but there is a necessity for a 7th day rest. In fact, there is actually some studies that were done concerning workers, and specifically, I believe it was either Stalin or it was Lenin who instituted an 11-day work week, and people started dying. Furthermore, there's been studies on what's called a circa heptad, or a 7th day biological or biorhythmic process that occurs in plants, animals, and in human beings that has some sort of indication that there's some sort of change or physiological movement that occurs in that 7th day. Now, I'm not going to get into the fact that the worship of the sun is directly connected to the Sunday morning church service, and I'm not going to get into the fact that it requires you to trust Jewish folklore that the Sabbath falls on Saturn's day or Saturday, or the 7th day of what we have accepted to be the week. Now, there are proponents and opponents of this, and the opponents say, wait a minute, it wasn't until the Babylonian exile that Jews actually had the counting of the week. That's not what my Bible says. My Bible says that the manna fell on a certain day and didn't fall on a different day. And that different day happened to be the Sabbath. So unless there was some sort of corruption on what day that might occur, the 7th day was the 7th day. Now, some people say, oh, but wait a minute, that starts over when the moon comes. Nope, that's not. We'll get into that in a minute. But the premise is that most people have accepted, including our American Christian culture, has accepted that Saturday, or Saturn's day, there we go with the Roman pantheon again, is the day, or is the 7th day, and therefore corresponds to the 7th day that we are about to discuss in creation. So we have 6 days in which there is a creative process, and in that 7th we rest, right? No, that's not what it says. It says God rested. Okay, we'll get back to that in a minute. But a more important question is, what is rest? And next we got to go from that to what is Sabbath? What does Shabbat actually mean? Okay. So the first and most important thing that we need to do is we need to accept that there is a counting of 7s that is cyclical and that is built into the process of things. So where do we get that connection? We get that connection in the Moedim. How so? Well, the micro jubilee, or the Omer, is a liberation of humanity from the slavery of their egos. Okay? It's a micro liberation that starts with the light of Passover. We won't get into that concept of the light quite yet. And ending at what? That 50th day, which is what? Pentecost. Pentecost. The pouring out, the time of pouring out of what? The Spirit, the Torah, right? Etc. The acceptance of the ketubah by the bride, the wedding procession of the irisin, or the betrothal phase. Okay? All what? Repeating. So if we have cycles instead of linear movements, then we have something very interesting going on. Is there a history? Is there a progression through time? Sure, but not how we understand it. Is there a future? No. Yeshua said tomorrow is not promised, so you cannot lie and say it is. The next second is not guaranteed. It could be that this next second is the last moment of the existence of creation, period, because all God has to do is take a breath and we're done. Okay? So, having said that, what is the point behind years? The Jubilee. What is the point behind days? The counting of Omer or Pentecost. And why is that important? What is the function there? Well, there's a few things. So we have the Moedim, which is the feast days. We have the Ot. That have going to stop existing after time ends for whatever is going to happen to this planet. Check. Okay, looks like we're back. Sorry, like I said, this thing is not working right. So the premise is that we have what? We have the cyclical progression of time, and that is all based upon the OTO, which are map markers in the sky. The feast days, which corresponds to the Jubilee and to the Shemitah, and then we have the days, which would have to do with the small Jubilee, which is, of course, Pentecost, right? And then we have the years, which is the large Jubilee, which is the 50th year. 7 Shemitahs, or 7 7-year periods, equating to 49 years. And in that 50th year, you have the Jubilee, or the time of release. Recall that a indentured servant kept 7 years. Right? Okay, so recall that a indentured servant cannot be kept more than 7 years. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to discuss if we have these sabbatical years, we have these sabbatical days, and we have these times of release in the 50th of those, right? So 7 Sabbaths or 49 days, and then the 50th day is Pentecost. 7 7-year periods, and that equates to 49 years, and then the 50th year is the Jubilee, and all those correspond to certain feast days or Moedim. And those Moedim have signs in the heavens with them. How do we know that? Because there are certain things that happen at those Moedim in the cycle of history that are significant and important. Okay? Now, having said all that, now we understand the 4th day, which is the day of illumination, is extraordinarily important to the cycle of a Hebrew lifestyle. Notice, we're not talking about tomorrow being promised. We're talking about what is supposed to occur at a certain time, if that time is granted. So, having said that, the next thing that we need to understand is the why behind it all. Okay, so we get that information from our Messiah because I want you to think back to Numbers chapter 15. In Numbers chapter 15, we have something occur. What is that something? We have a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And what specifically happens to that man? That man is arrested for gathering sticks on the Sabbath, right? He's arrested and he's put to death, which means what? Violating the Sabbath is punishable by death. Okay? Now, Torah doesn't apologize for that, so neither am I. I'm not going to get into how barbaric or how inappropriate or violent that is. I'm going to get into the concept that the realm of death and the concept of death is associated with the Sabbath, should you choose not to accept the Sabbath. Now, having said that, it is very, very important to understand the position that the intensification of all power in the universe is in, which means that we need to kind of talk a little bit about benevolence versus malevolence, okay? So in the satanic philosophy of Epicureanism, we have the test for the ultimate, or the ultimate test for the creator God of the universe. That test is God able to prevent evil? And the next question is he willing? Right? Okay. And so the Satanists say that if neither one of those can be answered yes, then that is a malevolent being. Okay? So the first question is can, or is he capable? Is there an ability for the intensification of all power in the universe? We'll just go straight to the top, straight to the conscious, intelligent energy that we call the creator. Okay? We should not be defining it by he or by any other element except can it prevent evil? Well, the first thing that we need to understand is what evil is. But let's say that we just go with, can it prevent bad things from happening? The answer to that question is obviously a very simple yes. So then they ask, well, if it can, is it willing to? Because if it can't, then why do we call it God? Why do we worship it? But if it can, is it willing to? And if it is not willing to, then it is a malevolent being. And the only way that we can prove that it's willing to is that it does. And so if there is any existence of evil that has not been prevented, then it must be a malevolent being. Okay, well, obviously there's a flaw in that philosophy, but what we need to do is establish that it can and is willing, and that should be sufficient to answer Epicurus's questions. So can it and will it? Yes, both are true. It can and it is willing to. Doesn't mean it always will, which we could get into. What does that mean? But generally speaking, we can say that for all intents and purposes, the creator is not malevolent by our understanding. So if we're dealing with benevolence, then we are dealing with beni, right? Beni, benevolence. Volence as a back end of that word is a state of being, and beni is going to come from the Latin concept of good. So benevolence or benefit both have kind of a root in goodness. So here's the question we need to ask. What is the purpose behind Torah? Because Western social democratic American Christianity, unfortunately, has its origins in progressivism that says that we can take a pagan, right? A without God, a pantheistic practice, attach it to the name Christ, and change its practice to reflect our love for God. Even though Deuteronomy chapter 12 says, do not do that. Now, having said all that, the premise is then that we have the Torah appearing to be malevolent to the extent that American Christianity, American Protestant Christianity teaches that it is actually a curse to practice these things. And furthermore, that it is a burden that we cannot bear, a thing that we cannot do. Well, I'm not going to argue that. All I'm going to say is it's a very inappropriate understanding of Torah. Because if we have a malevolent being given instruction to a lesser being, if we have a greater vessel pouring into a lesser vessel, it is benevolent, then that means that it is a force of benefit for us. But can we prove that? As Christians, can we go into the Jewish Talmud and we can go into all of the things that have to do with Sabbath and have to do with rest and have to do with not working and find a benefit? The answer is in the argument that Yeshua makes to the Pharisees when they confront him about his disciples harvesting grain and eating it on the Shabbat. And that is, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I was sitting there in the heart of Sukkot, cold, frustrated, covered in diesel fuel because I'm arguing with a World War II stove as to whether it's going to burn or not. Anguished, frustrated because I can't keep my family warm. Frustrated because I'm in the middle of the feast day and I don't feel joy, and this is supposed to be the season of our joy. In fact, when the people were cut at heart as they heard Torah on the first of the 7th month, he told them, you will not mourn today, for you are commanded to have joy. And I'm sitting there going, I'm commanded to have joy and I can't do it. I am trying to find the place where I actually feel joy right now. And this is exactly what the universe boomed to me. And when I say boomed, it came so harshly and intensely that I almost fell out of my chair. This feast day was made for you. This Moedim. Remember the post tense wording of the Hebrew. And they have been for you. I'm sorry, and they have been for, not for you. We will add that later. They have been for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And we have it as the Otiot, the Moedim, the Yomim, and the Shanaim. They have been for cyclical processes of the natural order of nature. They have been for order And then Yeshua turns around and says, they were made for you. This feast day was not made for me. You don't spend your time trying to magnify the intensification of all power in the universe during this feast day. You spend it for you. And my whole entire attitude and philosophy changed from that moment forward. And then a threshold hit. Remember, I told you, you change your attitude, a threshold hits, and then you overcome that threshold and you are slingshotted into your next season. So the attitude came, the threshold came, I overcame the threshold, and I was slingshotted into the next season, and that is the season we are in right now. That is the amazing, powerful teachings that are going to be coming your way. But what you need to realize is those signs were put in the sky for you. Those feast days were put into the year for you. The Jubilee is for you. The Shemitah is for you. The Shabbat is for you. Not you for it. Why is that so important? Because what we have done is we've made it about God. And when we did that, we made the mistake of forgetting that all of this is for you. All good things come down from the Father of lights. All things work for the good of those who are called by God and who love God. Right? That's the premise here. So it is for you. The Shabbat is for you. Now, here's the intrigue. There are instructions about what you are supposed to do on the Shabbat. Instruction number 1, you're supposed to remember it. Wait, how is that for you? Bear with me. Number 2 is you are supposed to cease. You are supposed to cease from all business negotiations, malakah. You're supposed to cease from all indentured service, ovadim, right? You are supposed to have a mikra, which is a ing of the word read, a reading, right? A reading. It doesn't say of what, but Ezra defined it for us, is a teaching of Torah, right? And then it is also supposed to have something to do with a gathering, because a mikra was a group of people getting around a circle around a fire and discussing the conditions of the camp. Well, obviously, we're not going to discuss the conditions of the camp on Shabbat. And we could get into maybe that we're not supposed to kindle the fire, but that's, again, another teaching. But the premise is this is made for you. The feast days are made for you. The Otiot are made for you. The Shanaim are made for you. The Yomim are made for you. The works in chaos, the days are made for you. So let's talk about days. Is days the 365 that count the year? No, that is a year is counted by the cycle of the moon. Because you count what? The moon starting as the new moon going into the waxing crescent, all the way to the full, down to the waning crescent, back to a new moon, which is dark, right? Month number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, stop, possibly a Shemitah. The Shemitah starts at the first of the 7th month. So we need to check that. But then 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 13, depending on what? The barley. So we're not working with a fixed calendar here. Tomorrow is not promised. Again, we're not working with fixed time. We're not working with a 365 or 364.99993 day, or a 23.9987 day. I'm sorry, year and day. We're working with sundown to sundown. We're working with first month after the barley is Aviv, 7th month, check yourself, right? See what year you're in. By what? The movement of the moon. It was never about a 365 day. Okay? So the reason why this is so important is because then we get into the concept of the lesser governing something and the greater governing something. Sundown controls our days. Moonrise controls our years. And it's all based upon the Moedim, which is all based upon certain signs and seasons that need to occur. For example, what happens in the sky in the 7th month? The moon is at the feet of Virgo, and the sun is inside of her body, right? And that is a very specific time. That is Sukkot, usually. That's my point. Watching the sky plays a role. You want proof? Go back and look in your astronomical calendar. Go back to the Sukkot of 2019. You'll see a comet in the womb of Virgo. That comet came out of space into our time period, into our clock that we would observe in the sky, the Otiot, and December 14th of that same year, COVID hit. There was another comet in the same location this year. So is that some sort of prediction? No, it's a sign letting us know that there's something going on with the clock. It's a predetermined ticking of the clock. It's just, for us, we see the story, we see the names, we see the alignments, and we understand that something is going on. For example, the Messiah is being born, which the rabbis couldn't even figure out, but the Magi did. Because why? They were sky watchers. They were Hebrew astrologers. What had happened in Babylon? That is not documented in history, but is documented only in the Tanakh. A Hebrew became the leader of the Magi. Do you think he practiced pantheistic Babylonian hogwash? No, he established a Hebrew philosophy and a Hebrew understanding of the stars and a Hebrew understanding of the constellations and a Hebrew understanding of the zodiac, or what we call the Mazal. Why is that so important? Because when you align things with the Hebrew, they make more sense. Once you align it with the actual natural order process of the language that Yahweh chose for his word and the philosophies behind it, all of a sudden things make sense. All of a sudden it makes sense why Paul would say the last days versus us saying the last days, and preachers standing in the pulpit and saying, well, Paul had great faith, but he was a little confused because these signs didn't happen. Israel had not become a nation yet. Whatever. Let's try again. Let's look back at the fact that when you have one day is 1,000 years and you have the 4,000th year as the fourth day of illumination, the Son of Righteousness is going to rise with healing in his wings, Malachi chapter 4, is the only way that you could know that that was when the Messiah was supposed to come. Because here's the intrigue. There is no other scripture that gives a timing except for Malachi chapter 4. Why were the rabbis looking for the Messiah? Why was Jerusalem disturbed when the Magi showed up? Because they didn't see the signs in the heavens. Because they were not sky watchers anymore. They had come to accept that as the dripping of the water in the clock set the watch, they no longer had to look at the stars to see when the watch was supposed to change. astronomical, nautical twilight, etc. So, a big question you could ask yourself: why? Why is midnight the darkest point in the night, beginning of your day? Ask yourself that. Why? You will find no proof anywhere in any Wikipedia, whatever, to tell you that there's a good reason why that's true. Okay? But I can tell you what my book says. My book says that on Yom Kippur, at sundown, we begin our fast. And my book says that at sundown the next day, we break our fast. Well, guess what? At sundown of Yom Kippur is the beginning of Jubilees. There's our Shanayim. There's our years. For you, a force of benefit for you. So that is all that we're going to get into today. But I think it's very, very important for you to understand that the fourth day is the first time that we have luminaries. And the reckoning of a day was from sundown to sundown. And so as a final piece, what then governed those first 3 days? You say, well, light. What light? Because then all of a sudden the days stop being the days, which should give you a taste of what's to come. But what you need to know is that the time was not reckoned by the hours and was not reckoned by an accurate clock, but it was instead one with nature, the barley and the aviv, the moon, and the sun, and the stars. You have a watch, and that's what governs your time. You are missing something very important, and we're going to get into that in these next few sessions. But for now, accept that the sun, moon, and stars tell you the otiot, the signs in the heavens, the Moedim, the feast days of Israel, not Yahweh. The feast days, I'm sorry, not of the Jews, not the feast of the Jews, but the feast day of Yahweh, that Israel would keep, observe. Moedim comes from the word ad, observe. They would observe the feast days. We observe the feast days. Remember, it says they have been for signs and for seasons and for years and for days. Signs, otiot, map markers in the sky, in the zodiac, in the mazal, right? And then we have what? We have Moedim, feast days. Then we have Yomim, days to count the Omer, which is the small Jubilee. And we have the Shanayim, the years to count the large Jubilee, which consequently activates at sundown on Yom Kippur, which means we govern our days from sundown, not nautical twilight, not astronomical twilight, not the pagan practice of worshiping their pantheon at midnight, but at sundown. As the sun fell behind the western horizon of Israel, which would have been behind the western horizon of the Mediterranean, the sun falls behind the chaos. The sun falls behind the disorder because it's the beginning of a work in chaos. Remember that concept. Please realign your brain from the Roman pantheistic concept of time to the Hebrew, ancient Hebrew nomadic concept of sundown. That's the only reason that we have the sun, is to tell us when sundown is. And for light to govern the day, which you're not ready for that yet. Okay, so having said that, and having given those interpretations and having given those points, it would behoove you to divest yourself, disfellowship yourself, disassociate yourself, cast out Roman, Greek, and Babylonian pantheistic worships that have been assigned to your Messiah and have been assigned to your God and have been assigned to your to your religion, not only without your permission, but without your understanding. And with that, I will say Shabbat Shalom.